Hi peeps, it's Angela. I have went ahead and made a base for my cuff using my Easy Cuff Kit from tinypandora.com. I wanted my cuff to be an inch wide, so I used the 1-inch template to cut the base and the interior lining, and then a 1.25-inch template to cut the top because that wraps around the edges and gives you that extra 1/8 of an inch on either side. I'm applying the Bacon Bond before I apply the fresh raw clay to my baked clay. When you apply your liquid clay or Bacon Bond, which you'll use as an adhesive to ensure you get a good connection between the solid clay and the cured clay, make sure that you also get the edges because this does wrap over the top and connect to the bottom. You'll just use your finger and smooth out any seams, and then I like to use a sponge for a texture. The sponge that I have that I'm using on this is a aquarium filter. I've just cut it up to make it usable size. I like the texture that gives. I'm going to cure her for a full hour, and while that's curing, I'm going to start making my feathers. I find it easiest when I'm making a lot of the same thing to start with a mold. A mold is just a tool, just like any other tool you have on your work surface. It is all in what you do with it. So this is actually a leaf mold, but I find that when I'm able to modify it, that it gives the most realistic look for a feather. So I'm going to mold my pieces, and then I'm going to alter them a bit. And I do that by individually forming little sections because I want this to be ruffled. It wants to have a more jagged feather look and not a laying flat smooth feather. So I'm just going to make some cuts and some more indentions and pull it apart in certain areas, tip it up a little bit, just alter it. There's a lot of different ways you can choose to make your feathers, but however you make them, you're going to need about 30 of them to complete this project. I did end up making a few more than that, but I got about midway through the project and was applying the eyes to it, and my profile was a little bit wonky. So I did end up going back after I had cured that stage and shaving it back off with a razor and reapplying it. So I think 28 to 30 feathers, depending upon how big you make yours, is an appropriate number or expectation for this cuff using a 1-inch base. If you wanted to make it wider or more narrow, just adjust accordingly. I'm applying the mica in layers, so I'm going to start with my lightest color first because once a mica adheres to the clay, nothing else is going to attach to it. So I just want to kind of ombre effect it. I apply the pearl along the veining, the green closer to the center veining, and then the blue around the very edges. And do tilt your piece and make sure that you get all of those edges covered. Because of the way that we're ruffling and moving the feathers, if you have underclay that's exposed, it's definitely something that visually catches your eye and can detract. All right, my base is cured and I have made all of my feathers. So now I'm going to start applying the feathers to the base. I'm going to put a tiny little mark in the center of the cuff so I don't lose sight of where that center is, and that's where I'm going to put the beak. So I'm going to use Bacon Bond or liquid clay, either or would work. The Bacon Bond just has a little bit thicker viscosity and makes it a little bit easier when you're working in layers like this. So I'm going to give it a coat up to about 1 inch away from the edge. It's not a completely covered bangle. It only goes down to right where the bend would start going underneath your wrist is where I chose to cut it off at. So I'm going to start layering on my feathers, starting from the bottom and working up toward the top where I will make a little bit of a different look to it by laying the feathers differently. They'll go more angled instead of straight on. That way it separates and gives it kind of a face. I'm additionally going to lift and open up areas of the feather as I apply it to the base. I'm keeping in mind that I want my owl to look a little bit puffed up, like he's annoyed that he's been disturbed. So I'm going to also check as I go and make sure that I'm getting a good solid connection between the feather and the base, and I will add additional liquid clay or Bake and Bond as I go if it's not holding quite firmly. Doing one side and then working the other, I'll keep an eye on it to make sure that I'm keeping it as symmetrical as possible. I'm going to take the feathers up to about 1/2 inch from the center point on either side, and then I'll make a face or crown type area to put on the top of it, where the eyes and the beak will give the illusion of a head. Continue applying feathers until you have about 1/2 inch clearance on the either side of your little marked area for your beak. I'm going to make the crown for the face. This will be the area that the eyes set in, and it gives a little visual separation from the body of the owl to the head. This profile did get a little bit higher than I wanted it to get after cured, so I do go back in and shave it down a little bit later in the video and then reform this, paying a little bit closer attention to make sure that it's not quite as raised. It was probably 1/8 of an inch too thick for what I wanted it to be after I got it done. So it's important to smush it together a little bit more just to lower that profile. Applying the extra Bake and Bond and liquid clay goes a long way in helping the stability of the piece. Even though I do come back and shave away a little bit of that hump where my finger is at right now, because that's the area that got a little bit too high. Because I had used a proper amount of Bake and Bond, it was easy to remove that clay without that section being disturbed at all. What I'm doing right now with ruffling and adjusting the feathers is probably what contributed to my piece being just a little bit too high. So less of that when you're working on the eye section. I'm going to make my beak by just taking a teardrop piece of clay, pressing it into my tile, and then bringing a point up in the pointed end of the teardrop. Then I'm going to apply mica powder. You might notice that I burnish with my paintbrush as I apply the mica to the surface of the clay. The clay will hold on to what it first touches, and I want it to be a very smooth surface. So I'm using the very soft nature of the paintbrush as a burnishing tool, making sure that I'm applying enough mica powder that there is enough material that it actually fully bonds with the surface. It's not a dust and go, I don't think. I like to burnish it so it gives a nice smooth finish. I'm going to use my silicone tool and lift the feathers that are right in that area that the beak's going to go. That way it just has a more natural, organic look to it, and the feather can drape a little bit across the top of the beak instead of just being a bumping edges together application. Make any final adjustments that you need to, and then cure the piece fully for 1 hour. While that's baking, I'm going to go ahead and make the eyes because I do want to bake them a little bit as well before I use them. I am using a 14 millimeter rhinestone, and with that I'm using a 17 millimeter ferrule cutter. Just make sure that your cutter is 3 to 6 millimeters wider than your eye, and you'll be fine. These little balls of clay that I flattened are a little bit higher than the rhinestone is at the middle point, just because I do want to leave them encased within clay. I don't want them fully pushed through the bottom. So they're probably 2 to 3 millimeters deep. And then I'm just pulling the edges up around the rhinestone so it's a little countersunk. And then I'm going to press and pull from the top of the edge to pull down the eyelid to give the kind of grumpy expression. As long as you keep the bottom of your eye half rounded, so that conveys the fact that it's an eye, then you can do whatever you want with the top lid, because the top lid is just expression, whereas the bottom lid is what defines it as an eye. So I'm just going to continue gently shaping that until I have two eyes that are representing the expression that I want. Now, you might not have both of your eyelids drawn down. You might have them sharper. You might have them more drawn into the outer corner, which would indicate more of an surprised expression. You could do it a lot of different ways, and it's surprising the amount of expression that is just within the eyes. You don't have to rely upon other facial features to tell what it is. You can just tell it by the eyes. After I get the texture on, I'm going to use my 17mm cutter, and I'm just going to center it evenly along the bottom of the eye, and then do that with the other one as well, so they match. If I had a bigger cutter, if I was using a bigger cutter, I would have more of the cutter on the top of the eye than on the bottom, just to keep that top eyelid carrying the weight of more, unless I wanted to make a creature that had a baggy eye, and then I might leave more on the bottom. It's all completely customizable, and it's just so simple. You can do a lot with it, and take it further than I have. I'm using pearl white mica on the inside of the eyelid, and then I'll apply the green. I just wanted to put a little bit of the lighter around it just as a brightening. Now I'm going to use my blade, and I'm going to hold it at a steep angle against my work surface and go underneath these eyes and lift them up. That should allow you to get them off your tile without them distorting. Just going to do any final cleanup, and then they go in the oven for 30 minutes. 30 minutes is a full bake cycle for clay of this thickness. You follow your manufacturer's instructions on your clay, and if your eyes are larger or thicker than these, you might need to bake them a full hour before you proceed. It quickly became obvious as I went to apply the eyes that the profile on the owl's face was just out of whack, and it was too wonky for what I wanted to do. So I decided to, instead of starting from scratch and starting over, I decided to fix this piece, and that was pretty easy to do. All I needed to do was remove some of the height that had been baked into the crown of the feathers that I had put on earlier. So I used my X-Acto knife, and I carefully shaved those high spots off. Then once those high spots were off and I had a more level area to work with, I built another crown the same way, just using thinner feather pieces that didn't have quite as much ruffle to them. So my whole objective was to keep the area flat so that the back of the eyes would actually set evenly and look better in profile with the beak. I'm going to rebuild the crown area, and I'm applying Bacon Bond pretty heavily to the area that I'm going to completely cover, just to make sure that I've got a nice bond on it, and that any of the area that I shaved off is covered by the new clay that I'm putting on, and it will completely disguise the fact that there was ever an alteration made. So this is where I lost the crown filming. I just followed it the same way that I did it last time, just being more aware that I needed to keep that flat. So I've got my fresh feathers. They are raw. I have not cured them again. So I'm going to use the fact that they're still raw clay to allow me to do some smoothing around the eyes, which are pre-baked already. Once I get those attached, I'm using quite a bit of Bake Bond so I get a good bond. And I will smooth any areas that get a little lumpy, clean up any Bake Bond that comes out from underneath the eye. And I will apply some mica and do a little bit more detailing of the feathers that I've just put on. Now I'm going to clean away the mica as much as I can from the beak and any excess that have gotten onto the eyes. Make any adjustments that you need to, and then cure the piece for 1 hour. After it was cooled, I did apply the Super Matte Air Dry Sealer from TinyPandora.com just to make sure that the mica had a protective layer on top of it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I can't wait to see your owl cuffs. Bye, peeps!